Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason Falciolo at IBM. I'd like to welcome you to this session. Thanks for sticking with us here to the bitter end. Well, maybe not the bitter end. Everybody's hopefully got some ice cream, maybe a sweet ending. It's my privilege to introduce Bruce Schneier, who will be speaking on the topic of Re-conceptualizing Security.
Hey there. Good afternoon. Thanks for sticking around. Though I guess we're all kind of sticking around for the weekend, but thanks for staying and not disappearing. I'm going to talk about psychology. A lot of the work I've been doing recently is on the more social side of security. A number of years ago, I started looking at security economics, and we actually started a workshop in security economics, and it's in its, I think, 9th year at this point, trying to bridge economics, information security. Because I actually believe that a lot of security failures out there are not technical, they're economic. And I mean, there's great papers, there's great work. More recently, Ross Anderson at Cambridge and I started looking at psychology and security. Basically how people perceive and react to threats and risks and security decisions. And we just had our second interdisciplinary workshop in security and human behavior in June at MIT. And the goal is to try to get together computer security people and psychologists and law professors and economists, and we have sociologists, anthropologists. There's a philosopher who shows up. We had James Randi the first time. There's a photographer who comes. You know, just a whole lot of people who are dealing with security and human behavior and trying to get them to talk to each other, because it turns out a lot of the things that we deal with, other disciplines deal with, except they use completely different language to talk about it, and they never talk to us, and we never talk to them. So I'm going to talk about some stuff that comes out of that. I'm going to try to talk about, the title I gave is Re-conceptualizing Security, and it's really a talk that invites you all to think about security and what it means. So security is really two very different things. It's a feeling and it's a reality. Right? It's a feeling and a reality, and they're different. Right? You can feel secure even if you're not, and you can be secure even if you don't know it. I mean, really, those are two different concepts mapped onto the same word. And it makes sense for us dealing in security to split those two apart, right? To think separately about feeling and reality. To think about when the two converge, how they diverge, why they converge again. And language is a problem here. Right? There isn't good English words for feeling of security and reality of security. It's the same word. And actually that, I think, is one interesting thing to think about. Why is it in our language, actually any other language I've asked about, is this feeling and reality of security mapped onto the same word? Right? Why are two concepts mapped onto the same word? Something's going on here. Right? Because we as humans are really good at naming things. And here's a place we failed, kind of spectacularly. So why is going to come up later. So if you think of security in economic terms, security is a trade-off. And I've said this again and again, like all security is a trade-off. There's no such thing as absolute security. In every case, security involves some trade-off, right? You give up something and you get some security. So, I don't know, what's some good examples? In a couple of months after September 11th, I was asked by a reporter, how can we prevent this from ever happening again? And I said, well, that's easy, just ban all the aircraft. Right? It's a nonsensical trade-off, but it would work. And actually, if you think about the hours and days of September 11th, it's exactly what we did. We pulled all the aircraft out of the sky. It was an extreme trade-off for an extreme time, and I can't think of anyone who says that was a dumb idea. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Makes no sense long-term, made sense short-term. So there's a trade-off. When I was a kid, I have relatives I grew up in New York City, who lived in a gated community. And this was a community of houses with a fence around it and guards. And they gave up some privacy and freedom of movement for some additional security. We could argue whether the trade-off was worth it or not, whether they got any security. but we're arguing that trade-off. All right, so the question to ask whenever you look at any security anything is not whether it makes you more secure, it's whether it's worth the trade-off, whether it's a good use of your security dollar. Right, and dollar is here is very general, right? We trade off money, time, convenience, liberties, freedom of movement, functionality. I mean, these are all things we might trade off to get some security. You might think of your front door lock as an example, or a bulletproof vest is probably a better example. Right? Probably none of us here are wearing one, and it's not because they don't work. It's because for us here in Las Vegas, 2009, it's not a good trade-off. It's not worth the cost, and it's not worth the extra weight and heat and loss of fashion sense, whatever else you're going to trade off to get this bulletproof vest. So a couple of things about these trade-offs. There's no real right or wrong. Right? A lot of these are personal. Some of us might have a burglar alarm, some of us might not. We might be neighbors. One of us has one of us doesn't. Right? Certainly our computer security might be different, the things we choose to do. Right? These trade-offs are personal. And the trade-offs are often about a lot more than security. And this is real important. Security trade-offs are often only have security as a piece of the trade-off. Right? The U.S. invasion of Iraq might be a good example. Right? It was presented as a security trade-off, but there was a lot more going on there in terms of foreign policy than just security when the government made the decision to go to war. Right, so people have a natural intuition about these trade-offs. It's another observation. Right? We make these trade-offs all the time, multiple times a day. Right? You made it last night when you decided to double lock or not your hotel room door. Right? You made it this morning when you decided to get in a taxi cab or walk. Taxi cabs are dangerous out here. Right? You made it at lunch when you looked at it and said, yeah, I guess I'll eat it. Right? We make these trade-offs every day, multiple times. We don't even realize we're doing it. It is so intuitive. It is part of being alive. And not only us, you and me, people, every creature does it. I mean, so it's the third thing you learn. The first thing you learn is how to stay alive, then you learn how to reproduce, then you learn how to, avoid predators. Right? So every creature does this all the time. Imagine a rabbit sitting in a field eating grass. And that rabbit sees a fox. That rabbit's going to make a security trade-off. Should I stay or should I run away? Right? And the rabbits that are good at making that trade-off will tend to live and reproduce, and the rabbits that are bad at it will either get eaten or starve. Right? So evolution favors making these security trade-offs well. So you'd think, as a successful species on the planet, you, me, everybody, should be really good at making these trade-offs. In fact, we seem to be hopelessly bad at it. And I think that is the essential question of security and psychology. Why? Why are we so bad when everything says we should be so good? Right? The short answer is that we make these trade-offs based on the feeling of security, not on the reality. Now most of the time, this works. Right? The reason we do it is it works most of the time. Certainly, it's true of human prehistory. When you start reading in evolutionary psychology, one of the conceits of the discipline, and it's actually very interesting, there's a lot of great stuff being done there, is that we have what they call Stone Age brains. Right? Our brains evolved for living in prehistory, not for living in Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. So we have, through the course of our evolution, developed lots of brain heuristics about risk and security because they make evolutionary sense. Right? We, like the rabbits, have a lot of cognitive shortcuts. Right? These brain heuristics are not based on a lot of thinking, because our relatives that do this don't actually think. They just react. They're meant to be efficient. Right? We are a species of satisficers. As humans, a lot of our brain heuristics about risk and security are based on stories, because we are a species of storyteller. And this is true. You can show a friend some data about the crime rate in New York City, and they'll go, oh yeah, that's data. But if you tell them about your cousin that was mugged when he was there last month, they'll get scared. Right? We respond to stories, not data. That's us. That's our brains. That's people. Right? And basically, we are optimized for risk trade-offs endemic to living in small family groups in the East African highlands at 100,000 BC. We're really good at that. Now, 2009 Las Vegas, not so much. We just haven't had enough experience in this world. Right? Modern times are harder. So I'll give you two reasons why modern times are harder. The first is technology. Right? Technology obscures a lot of risks. We all understand the risks in computer technology because that's our stuff. But my mother doesn't. Right? Technology, is a barrier between us and the risks. Real different than me standing in front of a tiger. I get that risk. It's real visceral. Right? Me sitting in front of a computer and then there's a tiger on the other end of the keyboard, that's harder. Work with me here. The second modern perturbation, as mentioned, is the media. There's a heuristic called the availability heuristic, and it's something we all do. We tend to base our assessment of the probability of something by how easy it is to bring instances of it to mind. Great heuristic for living in prehistory, right? If you can imagine a lot of tiger attacks, there must be, a lot of tiger danger. You can't think of anybody, getting eaten by a lion. Maybe they're a lot safer. But the media perturbs that. Right? The media takes the rare and uncommon and talks about it again and again. So people tend to believe that it is more likely than it actually is. Right? There's a magnification of the rare, and there's a simultaneous downplay of the common. So people are afraid of plane crashes and not car crashes. Right? Easy example. Because plane crashes are talked about in the media all the time, car crashes aren't. Even though 42,000 people die in the U.S. each year from car crashes. It's a huge cause of death in this country. But it's not something the media talks about, we talk about, so it's downplayed. So there's a lot written on the psychology of security, and there are other talks I could give. There's a great paper I wrote which went through a lot of psychology experiments, looking at risk, looking at trade-offs, looking at cost, and how we deal with security. If you type psychology of security into Google, it's the first hit. And that's an essay of mine, and if you're interested, I recommend you read it. It's really interesting and a little bit scary. What we're seeing, as I mentioned it a little earlier, this is sort of an amalgamation of experimental psychology, behavioral economics, cognitive science, game theory, neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, anthropology, sociology. A lot of these groups are coming together to study the brain and how we deal with risks. They put people in MRI scanners and ask them questions about risks. What part of the brain light up? Our brains look different when we're scared. That kind of thing. I'll mention quickly 4 biases in risk perception. One I mentioned before, we tend to exaggerate spectacular but rare but downplay common. The unknown is perceived to be riskier than the familiar. We fear kidnapping by strangers. It's been child kidnapping by strangers, right? The JonBenet Ramsey type of kidnapping, more than kidnapping by relatives. When you look at the data, the latter is much more common. Personified risks are scarier than anonymous risks. Right? Bin Laden is a bigger threat because he has a name. And we tend to overestimate involuntary risks and underestimate voluntary risks. Earthquakes versus smoking might be an example. Once we make the decision to take a risk, to smoke, to go skydiving, to move to California with its earthquakes, we tend to, in our heads, downplay the risk. When a risk is thrust upon us, we don't get to make the choice. We tend to exaggerate it. So the result of all of this, sort of all of these brain heuristics and ways of thinking, is that feeling and security get out of whack. Right? That they separate. That feeling and security no longer map onto each other. And we have some words for this sort of thing. Right? If our feeling of security is greater than reality, we think of that as a false sense of security or a naivete. If our reality of security is is greater than our feeling, I guess that's a false sense of insecurity. We don't really have a good name. Irrational fear, maybe paranoia in an extreme case. mean, those are the sorts of words we use. We talk about, I do, about products that address the feeling of security, not the reality. In cryptography, we call them snake oil. More generally, I use the term security theater, right? Things that make you feel good but don't actually make you safer. There isn't really a good name, and I don't actually have one, for products and services that address the reality of security but not the feeling. It's kind of like what in an ideal world we want the CIA to do, right? We make us safer and then not tell us. But I don't have a good catchphrase for that. All right, so getting back to economics, if the market drives security, right, and people make trade-offs based on the feeling of security and not the reality, then the economic incentives in any security industry is to make people feel secure. Right? That's what's going to sell the stuff. And there are two ways you can do this, right? You can make people actually secure and hope they notice, or you can make people just feel secure and hope they don't notice. Right? Both of which will work, both of which will sell your stuff. So now the question to ask is, what makes people notice? Right? What makes people notice if feeling and security don't match? Well, a couple of things. The first one is an understanding. Right? People have an understanding of the security systems, their limitations, what the threats are, what the risks are more likely to look at what's being sold, the reality, and see what it really is, and see if it maps to their feeling. Real-world examples make a big difference, right? Both positive and negative. We kind of know that if there's a new burglar alarm system in the neighborhood, whether it works or not, because we see if the crime rate goes down, or if police protection goes up or down. Right? We see changes in the crime rate, because there's enough going on that we can get an intuitive feel for what the reality of security is. Right? Security theater is exposed when it's obvious that it's not working properly, sort of in general. Okay, so what makes people not notice? Well, it's the converse of those things, right? It's a poor understanding of the risks, of the costs. And anyone who's doing computer security in a business environment knows this, right? Your bosses don't get the risks, they don't get the costs, so they're terrible at making these trade-offs. Not enough examples is a huge problem. If there aren't enough examples to judge whether something's working or not, how do you know? Right? My elephant trample protection device has worked perfectly the last 10 years. Or not. So we have an inherent problem of low probability events, that it's much harder to judge the efficacy of security countermeasures. I remember, it happened, maybe in 03 or 04. It was then Attorney General John Ashcroft showed up in my city of Minneapolis. He's giving a speech, and he said, it's been 2 years since September 11th. There's been no additional attacks. That proves that our policies are working. And I'm thinking, it was 2 years before 9/11. There weren't any attacks either. You didn't have any policies. What does that prove? It proves that terrorist attacks are rare. And perhaps the policies didn't matter very much. Or perhaps they did. Right? But looking at the number of attacks is not a good measure in this case because they are so rare. Now, it's really hard, especially people who are non-experts, to make security trade-offs for rare events. The third thing that makes people not notice is when feelings cloud the issue. Right? So the cognitive biases I mentioned, fears, folk beliefs. A lot of post-9/11 policy happened because we were all scared. And anybody who can make us not scared, we're going to follow. It's very true. Basically, people have an inadequate model of reality. Okay, so now I want to complicate my conception. Right? Add feeling and reality. I'm going to add a third thing. I'm going to add model. So feeling, model, reality. So three different things. Right, reality is immutable. It's the real world. It's what's going on out there. Feeling and model are both in our heads. Feeling is based on intuition. Model is based on reason. This roughly corresponds to, if you look at some of the literature in psychology of decision making, type 1 and type 2 cognition, the different ways people think. So in a primitive and simple world, in East African highlands, 100,000 BC, feeling and reality match pretty well. There's no need for a model. But only when things get complex do we need models. And in fact, the common belief now is that we developed our human brains to be able to deal with models, to model other people. That develop a theory of mind and model, I want to model your reality because that means I can interact with you socially in some meaningful way. Right? And that's the fundamental change that makes us human. So feeling, model, reality. Simple world, the model goes away because feeling and reality converge. In a complex world, we try to keep models in our head that we want to be close to reality. Right, so we can think about the world. I mean, we all have models about different computer security things. Right? I mean, those are conceptual models we have on how the networks and packets work and cryptography works and whatever it is we're studying. All right, so let me do a very short detour into brain science. There are two parts of your brain that matter on security. The first is the amygdala. It's kind of about here. It's at the base of your brain stem. It is a very old part of your brain, first evolved in primitive fishes. So all vertebrates have one. And this is the part of your brain that controls fight or flight. So sweaty palms, increased adrenaline, increased heart rate, increased muscle tension, all of that stuff happens when the amygdala feels fear. Happens to you, happens to the rabbit. Right? We share this with a whole lot of creatures on the planet. It is very, very fast part of the brain. It is faster than consciousness. You can show people a picture of a snake, and their amygdala will react before their brain realizes it's a snake. It's a separate pathway to fear. Bypasses consciousness entirely. Now, we can override this. I mean, the benefit of being human is that we can override our amygdala. And you know this is true because the last time, I don't know, your boss gave you a dressing down, your amygdala told you to either run away or spear him. Right? And in fact, you did neither. You stood there. And the part of your brain that made you stay there and listen is your neocortex. Right? It's this part of the brain. It's your frontal lobe. This is the part of the brain that's associated with thinking. Only exists in mammals. Ours is something like 8 or 10 times larger than any other creature. Right? This is the part of the brain that where consciousness lies, reason, theory of mind, all this stuff. It's the newest part of the brain. Nobody says this in brain research, but I'll say it. It's kind of still in beta testing. It really just barely works. It's a lot slower. It's actually where all the brain heuristics are. I mean, they're sort of higher. So it shows you, what kind of mess it is. And a lot of this you sort of have to take with a grain of salt. When someone tells you this part of the brain does that, they're really basically lying. Parts of the brain seem to be seats of different things, but things happen everywhere. It's a whole lot of cross-mixing. But these sort of are the seats of where these things happen. All right, so let's talk about the model. What is the model? The model is an intelligent representation of reality. Right? It's what separates us from the rabbits. Right? We have models. Of course, it's limited by the bounds of our information, of technology. It's limited in some ways by our cognitive biases, but it gets to override our amygdala. Where do we get models? We get them from other people. Occasionally we invent them, but most of the time we get them from other people. Some models come from religion, from cultures, from elders, from tradition. I was in South Africa on safari about 2-3 years ago, and the tracker we were with had a very complex model in his head about how to avoid a lion, a leopard, an elephant, and a rhino. You got to do different things for different animals. One you climb a tree, and one you don't. I think the rhino that they push down the trees, don't climb the tree. One you run away, one you don't. I forget. But he knew exactly what to do in every case. Right? Conversely, I grew up in New York. I have a much better model of security on the streets of New York City. You know, what streets look safe, what don't, how to act, how to look, how to walk, how not to stare, which he never had growing up in basically near Kruger National Park in South Africa. Right? So we both got our models from the society we grew up in. Right? You know, think of neighborhood crime rates. Right? You'll have a model of the crime rate in the neighborhood you live in, and it's based on, you know, the around you, what people are saying, what your friends are saying, maybe something based on what's mentioned in the papers or on TV. But you have some model. Models come from the media. They come from elected officials. You know, I've mentioned terrorism, child kidnapping. You know, the other examples of models that we tend to get from the media, because there aren't a lot of examples in our community for us to get a model from. You know, models will come from industry. So there's a pervasive surveillance camera security model in our society that comes from the security camera industry. I mean, closer to home, you can think of the security model perpetuated by the firewall industry. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but you know, a lot of people believe it because it's the model they have. A lot of modern technological models come from science. A lot of health models come from science. Think of SARS or bird flu or older cancer or newer swine flu. You know, we all have some model of the security and countermeasures and how they work for those different diseases that we got hopefully from science, you know, filtered through the media. New models might be very distinct from feelings. You know, it's hard for new models to take a hold. You know, global warming is a good example of that, of a threat model, which is really being resisted because it doesn't feel right. Well, it felt right yesterday, here, today. But you know, I mean, humans just aren't good at thinking in 80-year spans. I mean, we're good at, you know, the next harvest. It's about the best we can manage. Or maybe when our children grow up, it's probably a better example. But 80, 100 years, we're terrible at that. We just don't have the ability to deal with those models. This is a hard one to accept. Right? Also, as we become more comfortable in our environment, the feeling moves closer to the model. So you could read from, you know, over 100 years ago, literature about electricity in the early decades of electricity. And there were people who were afraid to you know, touch a doorbell because there was electricity in there and that was dangerous. Right? I mean, that's amusing to us today, but you know, I think of my father and a computer, and it's, you know, it's about the same thing. There's a computer in there. I don't want to touch it. Right? But as we get more familiar, our kids understand the internet in ways that we actually don't, because they're much more intuitive to it. And then the model eventually fades into the background. We no longer realize we have a model. Right? You sort of keep a model in your forebrain when you're using it consciously. When you get to unconscious competence, the model fades away. All right, so one more complication, and this is the notion of agenda. So I have a very relativistic view of security. It depends on the observer. Right? So if you think of any security decision, any major one affects multiple stakeholders. And each stakeholder is going to make their own trade-off based on their own costs and benefits. And remember, based on both security and non-security concerns. And the stakeholder that makes the decision will tend to make the one that benefits him. Makes perfect sense, right? If I'm in charge, I'll do the thing that benefits me, because that's the way it goes. So, you know, this is, I think, how to understand a lot of what happens in sort of major security policy debates. You can't just understand how the security works, you need to understand the agendas of the different stakeholders. Right, so, I mean, neat example I like to use is the debate happened about a year after 9/11 for arming airplane pilots. Huge debate whether we should arm airplane pilots. And if you looked at the stakeholders, you can see their agendas. The pilots tended to like the idea because carrying guns is cool. The flight attendants hated the idea because they had this model in their head of the pilot and the gun on this side of the door and them and the terrorists on that side of the door. And they just hated that story. It just never sounded good. The airlines tended to think about holes in my fuselage, which also seemed like a dumb idea. Most people, most travelers, most people commenting looked at it as a referendum on gun control. So if you were against gun control, you didn't want it to happen. If you're against gun control, you didn't want it to happen. If you're for gun control, you didn't want it to happen. And there was almost no debate about whether it actually improves security. I mean, that's the agenda. That's how agenda works. So back to the model. Stakeholders with different agendas will try to manipulate the model, and if possible, your feelings, but certainly the model. So think of marketing, think of politics. A lot of it in security is about model manipulation. Convince people to trust their feelings and ignore the model, global warming. Right? Convince people to have a faulty model, or marginalizing experts with better models, smoking 20, 30 years ago, great example of that. Manipulate the model itself. You see that in global warming. You see that in a lot of computer security things, where the industry will come up with these reports and this data that reinforces their model, even though it doesn't make much sense. So one example you can go through is the risks of smoking. Really good example of this, because we all sort of know the history. Initially, right, no one knew anything about the health risks of smoking. Right? Our model wasn't adequate. We didn't have a model of the health risks of smoking. And you can go read advertisements at the time. They talk about the health benefits of smoking. Right? Industry was trying to push this model of the health benefits of smoking. Science came up with a model that was closer to reality. So we learned about lung cancer and sort of all these things about the health risks of smoking. And the industry fought back. Right? They denied the model for decades. They marginalized experts that had the model. They funded their own experts with an alternative model. Eventually took a long time, the public came to accept this new model. Right? Now this new model is so ingrained, our feelings have converged about it. No one will say there's no health risks to smoking. I mean, we might choose to ignore them, we might choose to smoke anyway, but it's not because we don't think it's unhealthy. Right? Ask anybody. Other examples, you might think of the secondhand smoke debate, which is following the same trajectory, about 20 years behind. Seatbelts. When I was a kid, nobody wore seatbelts. Nowadays, if you get in the car with a kid, they won't let you drive unless you're wearing a seatbelt. Right? That's how much that changed. And compare that to airbags. Right? Following again about 20 years behind. ID cards is an interesting example of some conflicting models. And there's something to be said for some of the theories on cognitive dissonance. And when people have a particular model in their head, it can be hard to dislodge. And lots of experiments bear this out. If you believe something, you more readily accept evidence that conforms to your belief than evidence that contradicts your belief. So once we have a model in our head, it can be very hard to dislodge. We tend to ignore evidence against our model, because it's kind of hard for us to say that we're wrong. That hurts. We don't like it. So we tend to want to believe that we're right. And we will look at balanced evidence. I mean, great experiments. They take some issue with good polarization, some political issue, and they write a balanced paragraph with so many statements for it, so many statements against it. They show it to people on different ends of the polarization, and each side thinks the paragraph supports their side of the argument. Same paragraph. I mean, that's that brain heuristic working. We tend to ignore evidence that contradicts what we believe. So there is cognitive dissonance as we get evidence that we don't like, right? Especially if model equals feelings, then I don't even realize something's going on. So we'll ignore evidence against the new model. We'll accept evidence in favor of the old model. Eventually, both models exist in our head simultaneously. I mean, people are really good at holding contradictory beliefs in their head at the same time. Another thing you learn if you study the human brain, this whole notion that brains are computers, complete nonsense. We're much sloppier than that. But having contradictory things in our head, easy. And and eventually the model becomes a muddle, and then a new model supplants the old, sooner or later. And you could think back to possibly, if you're old enough, seatbelts or airbags or sort of anything where the model has changed in a few decades. Sometimes, this is rare, strong feelings can create a model. In psychology, these are known as flashbulb moments or flashbulb events. Right? An event so stark that it creates a new model in your head. September 11th is the most recent flashbulb event. For your parents, it was the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Everybody knows where they were. For some of us, the Challenger explosion. Right? I mean, something changes in our heads when that happens. A personal experience with crime is a very common flashbulb moment. Or a personal health scare. Right? A very visceral, big thing can change someone's security model very quickly. So, we're talking about a very complex technological world where we're trying to get models that maybe we don't even understand. Right? I mean, there's a lot of complication here. We're computer people, but there's all these health models that we don't study. And, there are airline security or even airline safety models that we know nothing about, or building safety models. We're trusting the ceiling's going to not fall on our heads. Not because we've studied engineering, we're trusting some model that someone else has. So when we lack the expertise to evaluate a risk, we rely on others. Right? We basically proxy our security trade-off to somebody else. Right? We've all done this sitting in this room, based on Nevada building codes. Right? We do it consciously or unconsciously, but we do it. And relying on this works, right? It works quite well. Building hasn't collapsed yet. I've been here for many years, right? As long as you rely on the right others. And so good models are based on science, right? Experiment, theory, real science. Bad models, tend to rely on other things. So, examples where we do it right are pharmaceuticals, airline safety, building codes. I mean, there we seem to get it right most of the time. You think of more traditional models, faith, religion, oral tradition. In the news every few years there's a story of some family who are denying their kids some kind of medical treatment because their religion doesn't think it's good. And we sort of look at those as, well, these parents have a really bad model that they've gotten from a bad place and they need a better model, a more technological model. A lot of these models fail because they're based on a static security posture, where in technology things change all the time. Right? So when the models are irreconcilable, you have conflicts resulting. You have deliberately manipulated models. Right? I've mentioned big tobacco, big oil also. Certainly there are politically manipulated models. Terrorism, I think, is the best example. More modern models, a lot come from government. So the government regulatory agencies, the FDA, FAA, OSHA, and in other countries you got your own acronyms for those. Have different models for security and safety. Other government experts, right? DHS, TSA, NSA. We could debate whether the models are good, but that's where they're coming from, right? Industry standards, and actual scientists doing actual science. Right? And I said this before, models eventually feed back into feelings. Right? People need to become familiar enough with the systems to accept the models, and then it gets reflected in their feelings. So when someone's feeling in reality is out of whack, right, the short-term fix is to directly fix their feelings. That's okay, you'll be better. Right? And that sort of moves their feelings closer to reality. It's manipulative, but it does work. The long-term fix is to fix the model. Instead of saying, there, you'll be better, explain to the person, enough medical science to know that. Or enough to trust the medical science experts. It's slower, but it's more honest. And slower is important here. Change happens slowly. Right? The shift in the risks of smoking took decades, and that was an easy one. Right? The current debate on secondhand smoke is still ongoing, and that one's pretty easy too. Right? Seatbelts took decades. It's very hard for us to make this shift of models. I mean, our best hope is information. And whether it works or not depends. So, the global warming debate, or watch the torture debate. That's actually an interesting one, where you're seeing different security models and a whole lot of muddle. But the hard part is not having enough information. And the annoying thing about this all is that the convergence of feeling and reality might not happen. Remember I said this feeling, model, and reality. And I said reality doesn't change. It's the real world. That's actually a lie. Because, we work in technology. We know reality changes all the time. Right? Different things become possible, become feasible, become cheap. So, instead of feeling chasing model, you've got feeling chasing model chasing reality. And this is the first time in human history that we've had reality moving quickly. And it's an open question as to whether the three could ever catch each other. We don't know. We've never done this before. Right? It might be that for most of the population, they will no longer ever have good models in their head for reality. Simply because reality moves too fast. Right? By the time my father figures out computer security, it's all going to be different. And change is happening faster and faster. So I'm not sure how this is going to shake out. But I do know, and this is important, that both feeling and reality are vital. I mean, I spent years sort of ridiculing security theater, and in fact, that's wrong. That there is a place for security that affects the feeling. Right? What's important are the relative levels, that feeling and reality are about the same. And when we build security systems, we need to address both. Right? It's not good enough for us to produce, let's say, an internet security system that works great, but no one trusts, because they won't use it. Right? That's just as bad as a system that works terribly and everybody trusts. Right? Both are bad. Right? In the long term, we want to give people a better model. In the short term, we need to address their feelings. And I'm going to end with two stories. The first one is the Tylenol poisonings. I know people remember this. There's a series of these, started in 1982. And this is actually horrific to describe. Someone bought a package of Tylenol from a store, took it home, opened it up, put poison inside, closed the cap, put it back on the shelf, and someone else bought it and died. Happened in 1982. This terrified people. And there was a series of copycats. People were afraid to buy non-prescription drugs, right? Even though the actual risk was negligible. And this is where the tamper-proof packaging industry appeared. Right? In response, companies like Tylenol invented tamper-proof packaging. Now, tamper-proof packaging is pure security theater. You can take as an exercise, think of 10 ways to get around it. I'll give you one, a syringe. Right? This isn't hard. But it directly addressed people's feelings of fear and saved the non-prescription drug industry. A great example where security theater did a lot of good. The second is sort of a more personal story. I had a friend who had a baby a couple of years ago. And I didn't know this, but in maternity wards now, when there's a baby, they put an RFID bracelet on the baby, and they give a corresponding ID bracelet to the mother. And if anybody other than the mother takes the baby out of the maternity ward, an alarm goes off. Now, it's designed to prevent things like baby kidnapping and baby swapping and sort of all those things you're terrified about. So I said, wow, this is interesting. And I went home and I looked up baby kidnapping. It turns out this basically never happens. Someone sneaking into a maternity ward and stealing a baby never happens. I mean, the instances are extremely few. Baby swapping is more common, but it basically never happens. Now, this is pure security theater. But I notice that if you are a nurse and you need to take this baby away from its mother and take it somewhere where the mother can't see the baby, you better have some really good security theater. The mother's going to rip your arm off. So again, security that addresses the feeling makes a lot of sense in this circumstance. So that's what I want to leave people with. sort of to think about feeling and reality as two separate things. To think about how they diverge, when they converge, their differences or similarities, and what we do to address each of them, and if it makes sense. So I'm happy to take questions, which I don't know how we'll do that. There's a guy with a microphone who probably has information for us on how questions, you've all been here, right? You know this. His microphone isn't on. Now, I'll repeat what you say.
If we could cue questions here.
We're queuing the questions here, where here equals there. Reality questions here, feeling questions there. Is that what you said? Okay. Yes. All right. So this is a question that question was AES. This question has nothing to do with my talk, but it actually is today's question. Because today we have a new attack on AES. People don't know this. I blogged about it this morning. So if you go to Schneier.com, you can read about it. There's been a group of cryptographers that have been working on AES. And this is the third in a series of papers that have appeared in the last few months. The attack is against AES 256, which is the largest key size, and is the first attack we've seen that is feasible. It is not against the full AES. Full AES 256 has 14 rounds. This attack is against 10 rounds. But the complexity is like 2 to the 40th or 2 to the 48th, something like that. I mean, it's really scarily feasible. It's a related key attack, which means we need plaintext encrypted with different keys that having a certain mathematical, whatever the word is, relationship, that's it. Nouns are the first to go. But this is phenomenally good work. So, I mean, the paper, I saw a copy of the paper last night. It should be up on the web in a couple of days, tomorrow or Monday is my guess. I'll put a link on my blog as soon as it shows up. This is a big deal. It's not an alarm. A couple of reasons it's not an alarm. This is still 10 rounds of 14, so we still have some safety margin, and the attack does seem to peter out. This is only an attack against AES 256. It doesn't work against smaller key sizes, and pretty much everybody uses smaller key sizes, so we're okay there. And it's a related key attack, which tends not to be applicable in most practical threat models. So those are 3 reasons we should not panic. This is certainly cause for concern. It basically means the security margins we thought we had for AES aren't as great. It's interesting, there's an adage, which I like to repeat in cryptography, is that attacks always get better, they never get worse. Right? This is along the same lines as an attack I published in 2000 that was against 7 rounds of AES 256. So the attack's gotten much faster, and it's been extended actually up to 11 rounds. The 11 round attack is still is on the edge of feasibility. It's 2 to the 70th operations. So that's the news. This certainly isn't the last word. It seems inconceivable that there can be 3 papers in rapid succession, and then that's it. So it's likely more improvements are coming. Recommendations, we'll see. Certainly using AES 128 is the best right now. I think that NIST should look at extending the rounds in a revised standard. Now, someone on my blog mentioned, actually, I thought like a clever idea which we need to think about more, that because hardware implementations have a large problem extending the number of rounds. I mean, you can't do it. It's hard-coded, that you define a single-key double AES standard, which I think is actually very clever, except I got to think about it for a while before I decide it's actually clever or just seemingly clever, but actually bad. Cryptography tends not to happen in comment sections of blogs, so I'll just tell you that. So that's the news. I mean, there's interesting implications for what's going on with the secure hash standard, because there are a number of submissions that are based very strongly on AES. And this might show them in a less good light. The attack's interesting. The attack is effectively based on the fact that the key schedule in AES 256 kind of sucks. Worse than the key schedule in AES 128. And there just isn't enough diffusion to get the key bits mixed in before the cipher. I mean, 14 rounds isn't enough. And so that's why the attack works against the large key variant and not the small key variant, that it really exploits the key schedule. Key schedules are hard. I mean, when we get together and design algorithms, key schedules end up being the place of most debate and most discussion and most work and most analysis. When we did Skein, the three-fish key schedule gave us the most trouble. Key schedules are really hard. One of the things that always impresses me about NSA ciphers is how simple and good their key schedules are. I mean, I think there's some theory that they're using that we just don't have. So that's AES. Thanks for asking. I was going to talk about it tomorrow at DEF CON, and I probably still will. But that's today's news. I mean, I wrote about this today. So you're at the cutting edge of what's going on. All right, there's a hand way back there. You got to ask NIST that, right? I mean, it's actually a lot of work to put on one of these competitions. So they did AES in what? 97 to 2000, I think was the time period, around there. They're in the middle of doing a hash function competition, which won't be done until, I think, 2011 or 2012. After that, it might be a good idea. But, these things tend to, there's got to be someone that's willing to do it. It's a lot of work. It's actually a lot of fun, and I hope they do. But, it's just the first day and we haven't heard. I mean, a quick fix would either be doing a revised AES-1, just like you saw SHA-1, did a minor change in SHA, AES-1, it just increases the number of rounds in all key sizes. I mean, that's an easy fix. Doesn't need a new competition. This single key double AES is another idea. So these are things NIST can do quickly, and that would work. That would just give this extra security cushion. I think they're more likely to do that than they are to, in the near term, have a new competition. Right, that being said, competitions are fun, and we'd like them to do that. But, I bet if you called NIST and asked them, they'd probably hang up on you. Because I sure would. I saw a hand in this area. Maybe not. There's a hand over there. I have trouble seeing. Is this one over there too? Okay, so there, and then I'll go there. But you first.
I had a question about the way you're mixing responding to feelings and reality.
No, back on the topic. Thank you.
According to the code, when you're dealing with situations, it seems as if the response has to take into account the proportion of each that you're addressing. And that involves some assessment of how much of the feeling maps to reality that the person has to use. Because this is sort of a bad example. Tylenol example. The Tylenol was poisoning. The original poisoning is not likely to happen a second time. And once the copycat story, the risk is actually going up somewhat. You make it infinitesimal in this particular case. There are situations in which the risk is going to increase over time.
Sure. Yeah, and the fact that risks change over time makes this hard. You almost want to, you got to address the feelings, and because you're building a product, the feelings in a few years, because that's going to be your lead time. I mean, this stuff isn't easy. I just read a paper out of Carnegie Mellon, which a psychology paper that shows something we all know, that people tend to ignore security warnings, right? We know this, right? And you see them, the security warnings you get in your computer, you click OK, everyone clicks OK, no one even reads them. The reason we do that is because we actually know that you click OK, and most of the time it is OK. Nothing happens. It's a crappy security warning, right? Our feelings are actually better than the program. I mean, the program is doing a little bit of cover your ass there. Well, look, we told you there's a risk, because it's not our fault. You can't sue us programmers. But we know that, expired SSL certificates, or, whatever it is, that the risk is small, and so we just click OK. Right? So we have sort of a better idea about the actual security. But yeah, you want a product that addresses both. I want a warning that only shows up when it's an actual warning. and only gives me a choice when I'm able to make the choice. A lot of the security warnings involve choices. Programmers tend to put dialog boxes up when they don't know what to do. I will ask the user. God, have you ever met a user? He has less clue than you do. If you can't figure it out, he's not going to figure it out. Right? We need to do better. Because if warnings were actually warnings, if I yell duck, you're going to duck. Right? But if I yell duck every day, you'd kind of start ignoring me. Right? Our brains are really good at processing this stuff. So yes, we have to address both. So you need the warm fuzzy of the green key, but it also has to be backed up by actual security. So I saw a hand over here.
You mentioned firewalls as
Ooh, you got a microphone. How'd you do
yeah,
that?
just being handed to me. I'm over the moon.
Who
but
handed it to you?
This guy here.
Fascinating.
What's your name? You mentioned firewalls as being one of those computer products which feelings and model are radically different. Can you mention some other security products where you feel that the feeling is far more important than the actual security they provide?
Firewalls are good because it's an audit item. So the checkbox is actually having one. So having it like turned on or having any actual filters is always secondary to you've got a firewall, check, right? So the model is that by existing in your rack, it sort of emanates security in some magical way. You don't need to actually filter any services because what the hell? Other examples. A lot in terrorism policy. ID cards I think is a good example. A lot of airline security. Things along those areas is where you see divergent feeling in reality. Stuff where there was a political motivation, because in recent years tended to push feeling reality apart. Some of the biometrics. There's a lot of FUD out there. When there's an industry pushing a particular security model, they often push it away from reality because you sell more that way. I guess those are some examples. So did you still have the microphone? Or did you give it to somebody else?
No, we still got it.
Wow. You can't just pass it around. You got to actually have questions. I'm going to take the hand back there. I don't care if you got a microphone or not. I'll take you next. I just didn't see you.
There's a lot of debate about policy, about checkbox-based auditing versus rule-based auditing going over, and there's a difference in opinion also between Europe, where they seem to be going more value-based, and the US, where they're going more rule-based. What's your opinion on that?
So it's value-based auditing versus rule-based auditing. A lot of this depends on context. The answer to almost all of these things is both have value and none are perfect. Right? So you have to do some of each. A lot of what I do in security auditing, I have checklists that I go through, but it's the stuff that is on the checklist that you always have to worry about. So I'm always a big fan of the word "and" in security. That when someone says A or B, it's almost never A or B. It's almost always A and B. So there's my non-answer answer. Yes.
So is the compliance regulations that we have now, do you see that as something that is beneficial, that gives you a good feeling? Or does it give us all the false sense of security that it's okay to give out that information to anyone who asks for it?
So compliance is interesting. We in security, and I've done essays on this, sort of two ways to sell something, fear and greed. Two motivators why we as humans want something, to buy something, to acquire it. One we want it because we want it. The other is we want it because we want to avoid the thing you have if you don't have it. So think of it as a fear sell and a greed sell. Greed is much easier to sell than fear. Fear is hard, right? I didn't have the firewall last month, I didn't get whacked, so maybe I'll be okay this month. You can always say stuff like that. And security is inherently a fear sell. And companies hate this. And why you see slogans like, we take care of your security so you can take care of your business, that sort of stuff. That's trying to turn security into a greed sell. It's complete nonsense. ROI models, they make no sense. Security is not a greed sell. It's a fear sell. So the way security tends to be sold is by pushing the fear button really hard. Because when people are actually scared, they'll do lots of stupid things not to feel scared anymore. It's hard to make computer security visceral. People try, but you get, what we call FUD, right? The fear, uncertainty, and doubt. People trying to sell fear. Again, marginal success. The only thing that's really worked to help sell computer security is compliance. Right? And so people buy security not because they care about security, because they need to pass the audit. Now, compliance is an extremely expensive way to sell security, because a lot of the cost, a lot of the money you spend tends to go on the compliance infrastructure, right? Getting the right certification or the right compliance documentation. So there's a little spinning around. But it actually is the best thing we've ever come up with to sell security, and to get companies to take security more seriously. So yes, I like it because it has improved computer security in our industry. It really has. I don't like it because it's a very inefficient way of doing it. There you go. There's a hand over there. There's a hand over there. Again, the guy.
There may be hands, but I have the microphone.
People down here get the microphone.
So in the years I've been in security, I see that as attacks get better, defenses get better, but not as quick as attacks get better. And certainly coming to Black Hat for many years, it doesn't inspire any confidence. And so, I'm certainly pessimistic about the state of the industry, ever more so. And so, really, what is your perception about will we ever achieve real security?
Ever's a long time, right? But certainly now,
In our careers.
in our careers is a short time. It's certainly, certainly attackers, and this is true in most areas of security. Attackers tend to take advantage of the technological developments faster than defenders. The basic reason is attackers don't have procurement cycles. Right? It is much easier for them to adopt a new technology, a new technique, and it takes longer and it's slower for the defender to adopt a new technology and a new technique. Right? So and you sort of look through history, you'll see different technologies benefit the attacker and defender. A lot of technologies in the turn of the last century benefited criminals. A whole lot benefited the police. Think of fingerprinting, and the biggest deal was the radio. Imagine the radio changed crime fighting in very profound ways. But sort of in our field, new advances tend to benefit the attackers, tend to benefit the bad guys. It'll change. The problem is we don't have any actual theory of security. We're kind of making it up. So it's a collection of techniques, kind of like medicine. A bunch of techniques that we sort of know work, and we tend to use them in different degrees in different situations. And the attackers are much faster to adapt, much faster to come up with new ideas, much faster to put those ideas into practice. So we're always playing catch up. So I think it'll change. I actually don't think it'll change in our careers, which actually means your career is assured. Because once it changes, you're kind of not needed much anymore. But as long as there isn't any real theory of security and collection of techniques, the attackers are going to be able to move faster than the defenders. All right, so I call on someone over here in this area.
So how should we deal with politicians who are, or policymakers who are implementing policies that improve the feeling of security, but actually decrease actual security? And how do we know how to make that trade-off?
Well, this is a hard one, right? The right answer is to vote them out of office, but that's often easier said than done. There is a predilection among elected officials to do something. The phrase I'll use is "something must be done. This is something, therefore we must do it." If people demand action, politicians have to respond by doing something, and doing something visible is what gets you points. And there's also a tendency to exaggerate the threat. And it's not political parties. You sort of think of two politicians, and one says, "This is a horrible threat. We're all going to die unless you do these things." The other one says, "You're an idiot. It's not a real threat. Relax. Don't worry about it." So this guy, if you do all the things and nothing happens, right? If he's wrong, he gets to take credit for it anyway. right? If he's right, then, we do the things and we're safe. This guy, if he's right, nobody knows. And if he's wrong, his career is over, right? So whatever side of the aisle you're on, you are incented to exaggerate the threat and to do something. And doing something visible that addresses the feelings will get you more short-term benefit than doing something invisible or long-term that addresses the reality. So, a national ID card is better to vote on than, funding Arabic translators inside the NSA, which no one will ever see. Reacting is better than proaction. Right? So if you, fund to increase the levees in New Orleans, and nothing happens, you wasted money. Even worse, something happens on the other guy's watch and he gets the credit for it. You're much better off waiting and then reacting, because then it's you who's being benevolent. So there's a whole lot of political motivations to get this wrong in a democracy. And there are no good ways to fix it. But the best way, of course, is to agitate for a change. I mean, that's this is the paradox of society, that we have no power individually, but collectively we have it all. And that's where organizations like EFF and EPIC come in, and different political movements, and you try to agitate for what's right. And no, this isn't easy. All right, so our hand over there. No, we'll fight it out amongst yourselves.
Okay. What can we do as security practitioners to try to get both security theater, so to speak, and reality to, go back towards together? What can we do to exploit the natural instincts that we have to actually increase reality and security?
So I think that our best defense is information. That information is our only way to make this work. And the more we give people the right information, the better we'll do. It's not great, it's not perfect, but I think it's our best shot. And I'll take the other question over there next.
So, based on what you're saying about defensive defenses, you do have an attention that it will at some point have a theory. I mean, what makes you think that? Wouldn't it remain a black art?
I do think there will be some kind of theory of security, some kind of theory of computation. I don't think it's anytime soon, but you see glimmers of pieces of it in theoretical computer science. You go to Stock or Fox or some of those conferences, or some of the theory of computing conferences. And there is stuff. There's stuff in complexity theory. There's stuff in automaton theory that I think will be some kind of theory of computation. I don't think it's beyond human imagination to come up with one. I don't think it's anytime soon. I mean, probably not in our lifetimes. But it's really hard to make predictions, more than a few years out. But I do think there is something that we're not going to be forever playing catch up. Just like I think there'll be some unified theory of medicine sooner or later, but no time soon. All right, so I gotta go, and so do you. So, any last questions? I'll take one more question. Who is be the last questioner? You'll be judged by your peers at the quality of your question. Does anybody want to take the challenge? It's one person over there. It's pretty risky.
You recently blogged about, I forget the example, but...
Sorry, say again?
You recently blogged about an example where a figure was given that 20 children die a year that are under 5 from eating asparagus, and that most parents would interpret that number as a very bad number, but in fact it may be very good. So why are we drawn to think that it's bad versus a good thing, that maybe that's a good food to feed your children?
This is something I blogged. It's sort of the larger question of newspapers are terrible at math. And whenever they give a statistic, they almost never give context by which to interpret the statistic. And the greater answer is that we are a species of storytellers. We respond to stories. We don't respond to data. So this particular story was about a child suffocating in bed because he was sleeping with an adult. And this happens 20 times in Minnesota in some period of time. And I couldn't tell whether that was more than usual or less than usual, a good state, a bad state. Was it more likely to happen if they were with an adult or not with an adult? And I mean, nothing was there. But what people were responding to was not even that piece of data, was the story. Here's a really bad visceral story with names and pictures and crying relatives, and there are 20 more just like it. So it's 20 times as bad. And that's what people are responding to. And people who are good communicators, are good at this. I mean, if you sort of listen to sort of my talk, you responded more to the stories about Tylenol, about smoking, right, than you did to any of the stuff about, how the brain works. Right? And stories are what we remember, they're what we react to. And being a good communicator is often being a good storyteller, because that's how we learn. Right? What I want newspapers to do is to pick stories that support the data. Unfortunately, the best stories are the outlying stories. Right? Nothing happened to me today is a boring story. So you pick the one person in 100,000 that something bad happened to, and that's your story. But that's why. I mean, people are very bad at math. I mean, that's documented by so many studies it'll make you weep. But also, we don't even respond to the math. We respond to the stories. So that's it. Thank you very much. I'll be speaking tomorrow, I think 11:30 at DEF CON. So come back. I'll talk about AES again, because someone else will ask. And so maybe you come in after like 10 minutes after I start. Then we'll do stuff. Thank you.